In this episode of the Ugly EVO Build blog, we're going to take a look at fixing our sticky shifter, changing out our lower intercooler pipe, and along with that, our J-pipe. And by the end of the video, I'll share some bad news for me that might be some good news for you. So we're back at ASM and I'm working on the Ugly EVO build. So the shifter was very sticky and I bought these torque solution shifter cable bushings thinking they would help fix the issue. I did install the shifter bushings and I will do a full how-to video on that coming out soon. But for now I just want to say the main issue with my shifter is that it was not returning to neutral. Basically it would not ever want to center itself. And spoiler alert, the shifter bushings were not the main issue, but I'm still glad I changed them. So of course, to get to these shifter bushings, I had to remove my battery, then remove my battery tray, and then I could actually see my shifter linkage that bolts to the transmission and these shifter bushings. No surprise, things are a little rusty here, again, of course. But what you're seeing is me actually shifting side to side. This is what it looks like when you're shifting side to side. And the piece where you see the little blue, that piece is where two shifter arm linkage pieces basically meet. And that was actually the main issue. This will be potentially your main issue too if you're having a similar problem. So of course I just popped off the shifter linkage and then prematurely actually removed this bolt or this nut I should say. Didn't have to remove this nut yet because I couldn't actually separate this arm. So if you're doing this job, you don't need to remove this nut quite yet. But again, this is the source of the issue right here. So there's a flat washer, a lock washer, and a nut holding that on. And then there are two bolts that actually hold this arm to the transmission. And you need to take note, I guess, of that little white clip that goes underneath that other shifter arm piece as well. We're going to talk more about that later in the video too. But I removed those two bolts that were holding this arm in, and then I could remove this arm assembly. And no surprise, it was tight. It was hard to move. It did move, but it was hard to move. And luckily now that it's out of the car, we can show it to you a little bit better and you can see. This was actually after I pried on it for quite a while. I was able to separate it, made it look easy here, but I had to put it in a vise and then pull it apart that way. But this was my main issue here. Of course, I'm still glad I changed my shifter bushings because they were also kind of seized in place and weren't spinning like they should. But the main reason my shifter felt so stiff and wouldn't want to return basically to that center natural position was because of this shifter linkage portion right here. It pretty much just ended up getting rusty over time, so I cleaned it up with some sandpaper, made sure it would rotate well on there, and then added some grease and put it back together. So hopefully great news for you guys. If you're having an issue like this, it really shouldn't cost you anything but your time for the most part to get this fixed. You don't need to buy the torque solution shifter bushings or any other shifter bushings. However, while you're in there, as you can see here, these are seized in place. They should be able to spin, and they don't. So be ready to destroy your old bushings to actually get them off, because it can be very hard to get any grip on that part of the bushing to actually spin it with that rubber around it. So I basically ended up cutting away that old rubber, and then as you can see here, I'm actually utilizing my heat gun, putting some heat to it and then putting a vice grip on it to actually get that old part of that bushing loose. I did do something similar with the other one that was still on the car. I wasn't able to take that arm off completely, or I decided not to take that other arm off completely. But for the other larger shifter bushing, I will just say I was able to, after spending about a half hour cutting away that old bushing and then prying on it, I was able to get that one off without any heat. And for a rusty EVO with 200,000 miles, if I can get mine off without any heat, hopefully you could on your car as well. And here we are just showing those torque solution shifter bushings on that shaft, and they should be able to spin around freely. And of course, this isn't a full how-to, just showing you that I put things back together and that it did shift quite a bit better after I made this change. So of course I did some testing once I put it back in, and it did definitely shift a lot better. It took a little bit. It still was kind of slowly moving more towards that centering position, but as you can see, it's a lot better than it was before, and it seemed more normal, more like it should. But one thing I did want to point out, as I was talking to someone on Instagram about this, you can see that white piece basically that sits there, that little white plastic clip. It does seem like it has a very loose like tolerance to it. So I do want to give a shout out to project_evo_. I talked to him on Instagram, and he actually informed me of a new part that I didn't even know was out there, that it seems like it would be a good piece from Ross Sport. It seems like just a tighter piece to actually hold around there to keep it from having so much slop. So if I would have known about this piece ahead of time, I would have ordered it and changed it out. I may still change this out in the future, but just giving you guys a heads up. Moving on, the next thing I did was ended up changing out that lower intercooler pipe and that turbo J-pipe. So of course, to do this more easily, I took off the front bumper cover. And now I'm just showing you that weird, crazy design of that stock lower intercooler pipe. And, you know, we're going to do just a quick edit, snap of the fingers. And here we go. This is the better one. This is an aftermarket lower intercooler pipe that we swapped on. Once I had the right coupler, I was also missing a coupler, a reducer coupler to go from the J-pipe to this lower intercooler pipe. So I had to purchase that as well. But I got this swapped out. And here you can see the wonky design. I don't know about you, but I think one of them would flow much better than the other. And because I mentioned it in my previous video but didn't actually show it, this blue hose here is just running from the J-pipe nipple, running that vacuum hose directly to the wastegate, the internal wastegate. And what that's going to do is just limit our boost to whatever the spring is within that internal wastegate, which I believe is, I think, like 10 psi. And here's just a comparison shot of the two J-pipes. The one on the left, the longer one, is an EVO VIII J-pipe, and the one on the right is the EVO IX J-pipe. You can still buy the EVO IX J-pipe brand new from OEM Mitsubishi parts dealers, so I recommend doing that if you need to. And here's why, of course. It doesn't look like as much space right now, but this is the EVO IX J-pipe, and here we cut to the EVO VIII J-pipe on the EVO IX Turbo. It's so tight, it's very close to your starter. I definitely recommend, if you're putting an EVO IX Turbo on, you're going to want that EVO IX J-pipe. You can see how much more clearance there is, how much better of a fit there is. So since the engine did have a couple heat cycles on it and driven a couple miles, we decided to change the engine oil, get rid of that break-in oil, and then I took it for a test drive, and I got to fill it up. I put gas in it. Hooray, exciting, fun times. Until I got about 4 gallons in, and it was leaking. So it's leaking out the top where basically the fuel pump assembly bolts in, and of course it's rusty. And most of you know I have a JDM, brand new JDM gas tank that is kind of ready to go in, but I did not want to tackle that job yet. There's a spectator race coming up soon in basically about a week or so that I wanted to do that I don't think I'm going to be able to do now if I need to replace this fuel tank, because I don't know if I'm going to have time to do that. But good news for you guys, I do plan to film it. I do want to figure out for sure that this JDM fuel tank will work. So that is next on my list, trying to get this fuel tank swapped out. I also still need to finish installing my wideband gauge. I want to get that hooked up as well. And from driving it a little bit, I could tell there's some noise in the rear, so not too surprising. I think it either needs CV shafts in the rear or potentially new rear wheel bearings as well. Also still need to swap out the rear shocks. So there is still quite a bit to do. When a car like this has kind of sat for so long, it's one thing to have it actually driving up and down the road. It's another thing to really consider it fully drivable. So there is still quite a bit to do, so stay tuned. But as always, this is Paul from Boosted Films, and thanks so much for watching.